This episode of the Leap Forward podcast is brought to you by bridgeLT, leaders in conversational learning and innovation. Through AI role plays, technical simulators, and comprehensive training programs, bridgeLT is revolutionizing the future of corporate and enterprise education.
In this episode, Serena Joseph takes us through her career journey from starting as a Barclays graduate trainee to becoming a leading consultant in risk and compliance. She discusses how technology and consumer-focused approaches are reshaping the regulatory landscape and offers insights on simplifying compliance and building trust within organizations. Tune in for a closer look at the future of risk management and governance. So I'm absolutely delighted today to be joined for this edition of the Leap Forward series of podcast by Serena Joseph. Hi, welcome.
Thank you very much, Justin. It's lovely to be here.
It's great to see you again. So for those that don't know you, tell us a little bit about what you do.
Okay, well, my work comes in two halves. Some of the time I'm a non-executive director, two banks and a lender. So chair of risk, chair of governance, nom and rem committees. So sitting, looking from a strategic viewpoint, sort of sitting on your hands because you're asking the questions, you're not doing the doing. And that's a line you mustn't cross. On the other days of the week, to get my itch to get things done, sorted out, then I work in consulting. So board advisory work, quite a lot of training work, a lot of work for regulated businesses where there are approved people who are approved by FCA and sometimes PRA as well. And alongside that, sorting out problems. So operational governance, formal governance, processes, people training, making sure the two are actually matched up. And actually the people who are doing what the processes are saying they need to be doing and doing it right. But I really enjoy making things work better and joining the dots, making sure an organisation is really effective in delivering and achieving its commercial goals.
And let's go back to the beginning. How did tell us a little bit about the journey to date?
But it all started really by mistake. I started as a Barclays graduate trainee and did the bank manager training route, the compulsory exams, did some years after that in network planning, reconfiguring Barclays network, and then went into consulting, into strategy, was placed on a project at a regulator called SIB, and discovered I really liked looking at rules, regulations, how you practically apply them, steering my way through. So completely by mistake, I then ended up joining and helping form the regulatory practice at KPMG, was then when I built it to a couple of hundred people, was poached to build the same thing for EY, then went to Mazars as a partner to build one as well, and then took the business freelance, set up my own business, been doing the same sort of thing ever since. So that's what I'm known for.
And you are very well known in the industry. And I think you really do have a very kind of, I think, interesting kind of perspective on this world of risk and regulation and compliance. Tell me a little bit about that.
Do you know the really important story that sticks with me, the 2008 crash? I was friends with a very senior regulator who said it was coming. In fact, the coffee was at Costa the night before the Northern Rock story broke. And he said there were 20 firms on the watch list, so the regulator is concerned about. 19 were there for what the humans were getting up to. One was there for capital shortages. And I've always thought it's always the people. And wherever you go in an organisation, whether it's the leadership, Barclays, we called it the marzipan layer of many, many grades of middle management, blocking the messaging or selecting the messaging, and right down to, the people at the front. You've got this need to align what you're doing from the top through the middle to the front line, because the frontline staff often know what they need to do. They're dealing with the customer. They've got to get it right. They're at the sharp end. And they in the top need to make sure that they're really implementing and understanding the same things. And that's what I get a great deal of pleasure of, making sure that the organisation's actually fit for purpose and then working really well.
And how do you get that balance right between, because you said at the beginning that, you've got to kind of remain I suppose, in a sense, in some way, an advisor. But then to get that, to make that happen, how do you kind of actually make it happen?
Well, quite often I get pulled in to start with an advisor, a diagnostic high level review,
Yeah.
something like that. So it's a sort of, how does it work? Can I work out the formal, the operational governance, the people governance, how the processes work, if they've got anything about risk management, where that links to how much money they're trying to make this year. Does that all feel sensible? And then there'll be things that are broken, not working very well, things that are missing. If it's a regulated firm, FCA regulated, then some of that governance stuff needs to be in place. So I will roll up my sleeves and sit alongside a team, or if they haven't got the skills, I'll do the doing, and then I'll find someone to hand it over to and train them. And at the end of the phone, if they then want to do something more, then they can come back and I'll handhold. But it's very much helping people, knowledge transfer, letting them get to the point where they've got the confidence that they can do it for themselves, and they understand why they're doing it and why it matters to keep doing it. Because that's the problem. A lot of the time, if somebody's got a remedial project to do, so they've got to sort something out because FCA is breathing down their necks, they sort of sort it out, but they don't embed it afterwards. And then it falls the wayside. It sits on the shelf. It's boring. It's a bit of effort. Why not go and do the fun stuff? Selling's far more fun than doing the admin. The usual sort of torn debate in a business. But it's getting to realise how much having all that housekeeping cog stuff done means it frees up the time and the thinking and your understanding of the business, and you can make more money, and you can make it in a way that the regulator is comfortable with.
And you mentioned the Northern Rock and the crash. Tell me a little bit about how has compliance and regulation evolved over your career, and then perhaps we can kind of dig into where we are today.
Well, when I started out, there was really compliance with the regulator at the time, and there'd been a whole string of acronyms on those. I'm not going to bore you. But, it was very much, do we comply with their rules? Are we in trouble with them? No. End of story.
Right.
And then there became a recognition of the value of risk management. So actually, instead of going, we've got these issues or these problems in the business, calibrating the risks, and in a non-numeric, non-quanti way. So you'd always had credit risk if you were lending, I'm going to get my money back. What's my bad debt provision? But this began to become an industry that was quite embryonic, became more established. The Prudential Source Book of the regulator started people really thinking about how much is that operational problem going to cost us if it goes wrong. So you began to get a language, a taxonomy around developing an understanding of what are the risks. What's our appetite for how much we're going to have go wrong? How much money do we have to put in the kitty to pay out when that stuff goes wrong? And then from that, you develop your mitigants, your controls, or who's in charge of those controls, which piece of process. Can we do the process smarter? Can we use AI? Can we use tech? Can we move away from spreadsheets? And then all that way through, you sort of then got your mitigants, you've got your controls, then you're testing those controls, work back to internal audit, or, the head office team or whatever. But that became something that became a career path. And you've got the evolution of the CRO, the Chief Risk Officer, who quite often sits either alongside or in as senior to the compliance officer. So that's really how the industry's morphed, the whole creation of what is now the second line of defence, using the jargon. So you've got the business, you've got this risk and compliance, checking you're doing it right, keeping you right. I think people think that often it's just going to tell you off, but actually a really good second line is really advisory. It helps you design it right, design the product right, design the selling right, looks at those risks up front, sort of designs them out as much as one can, and then sets you free to go off and do what it says and what's been agreed.
And as that whole, I suppose, in a sense, industry and that whole series of functions and roles inside it has evolved, how has the regulator kind of evolved alongside that?
The regulator's got the ability to pull in a number of specialists, so it builds up the specialist teams. It produces the consultative papers that set out its thinking, its evolution. So the really interesting sort of example at the moment has been the behavioural economics that has been the forerunner of the consumer duty initiatives and the requirements. So there was a lot of interest in what consumers do and don't do, and there were teams at FCA who were looking at what consumers do in response to particular issues, to risks, how they find financial services unnavigable, what they really do and don't get. And although we had the conduct rules and treating customers fairly, which is a piece of jargon that's been around for years, um, it wasn't in an accessible enough format or structure that all firms were able to get with the program. So I think it's really interesting that the regulator is shaping the thinking, defining the framework, consulting on it, then making the rules, and then ensuring that the rules are followed.
It's fascinating. And that whole idea of accessibility, both to those that are, kind of being tasked to follow them, but also educating the whole market. How do you go about doing that?
Well, that's part of the struggle, isn't it? I mean, who's ever been excited by financial services products? There is the statutory objectives of FCA give them a sort of an education, but actually Consumer Duty puts an education and a helping the customer on their journey. So if they're on a buying journey, if they want a new car and they need finance, then there are now obligations about how you do it. So there are 3 cross-cutting rules and 4 outcomes. But basically it means from beginning to end, you make it clear, simple, transparent, you're helpful, you explain at the level the customer can understand what it is their options are about how they can or can't afford to buy a particular vehicle. So all firms should now be following that. And then the issue becomes, how do you get your staff sufficiently conversant and capable that they understand what it is they must do, what it is they are allowed to do within the firm's policies and procedures, and the places they mustn't go. And a key part of that is identifying vulnerability. So customers, whether for health reasons or their own capacity, cannot make decisions. And then knowing that you've got to bring somebody else in to help them, and you've got to be very careful on any sale. So I think that's sort of how it's ended up being practical, but there are the 2 sides of the coin. And if the consumer doesn't really want to learn and read it, they'll read mail, Sunday Mail for market money stuff. They'll read the Sun Money, something like that. Some people might read a broadsheet. There are quite websites, they follow Martin Lewis. And so people have an understanding, they sort of get it. But when you look at the educational capacity of people, particularly start banding interest rates around, then you're in a situation where a lot of people really don't get the math. And you've got to come back and take them at the pace they can do, sell it correctly. And my rubric's always been, would I sell this product to my granny? And would I be embarrassed to tell my friends I worked here? And I think those are 2 really common sense ways of knowing if your culture's right.
Guiding principles, I suppose.
Yeah.
And how have you seen sort of technology play its role in this?
When I started at Barclays, we were hand machining the checkbook codes and the check codes by hand every night into the mainframe. So, and I'm not that old. I really am not that old. But and there was a machine room full of the machines of banking, and it was manual. And now you just sit on your app and flap the money back. So I work with Crew, and it's all app based and tech, and we take it for granted. It's just a light switch. We just do it. The idea of waiting 5 days for a paper check to clear is sort of rather out with the arc. But it's been very much the gradual introduction of PCs on tabletop, onto laptops, into phones, mobile phones, not the great big Mars bars, then the StarTAC, the Oyster, right the way through. But I think we almost don't notice how much more capable tech is. And now, of course, we've got the great AI debate. And in a firm, of course, if you're using AI, you've got to have control of the assumptions that the AI is making. So model management, and that's a different sort of governance that I'm sure the CROs will shortly be very deeply into. But I think what's interesting is that we've gone from classroom training to some classroom training, probably not enough sitting alongside Betty, as it was called, and learning at the side of the desk with somebody, through to quite a lot of often not very exciting and very generic CBT, computer-based training. So sitting at your desk, headphones on, or sitting at your desk at home and chugging through the screens, trying to remember it all, passing the quiz, asking a mate when you can't do it, and hoping that that's it, done for a year. And I think that approach to learning really undermines the cultural appetite of an organisation to get it right, and also their ability to prove to the regulator that they have got staff who are competent, sufficiently competent and appropriate for the job. And I think that's a really interesting wrinkle. I think it's what's going to come out of the current difficulties in the motor industry around the FCA sales activity.
And tell us more about that.
Well, I think that there's probably been a lot of keeping it too simple for the customer. Some firms potentially have toggled, they've pushed a particular rate or a deal for financing towards a customer, probably in the spirit of helpfulness most of the time. I don't think frontline staff usually want to get it wrong. Some might be greedy for their commissions, so there are places where there is that toxic element. But on the whole, if you've got to face the punter, you want to do it right. You probably also want to live. So you're in a really difficult position if you're in a commission base, and particularly if your basic salary is not enough to live on. If you're somewhere where you've got a reasonable flow of customers and each sale doesn't matter so much, I think it's easier to go, well, I'd choose that one if I was you, in the spirit of helpfulness. But proving that that didn't cross the line, that it wasn't motivated by the incentive of the commission payment, I think that's where the industry's caught a cold. And in a sense, it could have learned earlier, because it could have looked at all the other mis-selling and then all the ambulance chasing mishaps over the years, mortgage endowments, pensions, bonds. It's like, what's the next one, And I think that unpicking that and moving forwards, and there will be redress programs, and the regulator will oversee that through its enforcement capability. So let's leave that to one side to an extent, but it's almost the question of, what do you do next? You've been put on what we call the naughty step. You've got to get off it. You've got to prove that you're off it. You're going to have to make some changes in the business. You're going to have to rethink the commercials. You have to rethink the training, the product approvals, the procedures, the marketing literature. All those things are all linked. You're going to have to think differently about how you manage the risks and how you oversee it, whether it's in a particular showroom with a forecourt, or whether it's sitting at head office with a big distribution network. So there are lots and lots of pieces about how do we start getting this right in a way that actually the front line can actually do. Because I think so often something is engineered as a consequence of these interventions by the regulator that is so unwieldy, so full of paper returns, checking this, checking that, doing this, doing that, loads and loads more CBT, which everybody dreads. And it sort of defeats itself, because instead of saying, well, what's the step change and what's the clean decision, and how do we think our way out of this problem smarter, and actually use it as an opportunity to park the past and do something fresh, and use technology, use AI in training, have lots of fun videos and clips, have gamification of training. Then the staff are going to remember. They all know all the characters in, Fortnite or whatever they play. Everybody knows it. Everybody understands it. So make learning as much fun as that.
Yeah.
And then put your governance and your oversight in to check that it's really retained. Do your sports checks, and in the background, design your processes and your oversight so that you're enabling the staff to just invisibly sell it right, not bolting on, a bit of a rule book here and going, they're not compliant with the handbook. Oh, tut, tut, tut. Do it a different way. Turn it upside down. Start again.
Make it intuitive almost.
Yeah. And do it from there. If you want to sell it right and sell it cleanly and reduce complaints and make it really easy for any customer who walks through the door to get to a decision that is sensible and right for them, and then they'll go and tell everybody it's a really good showroom and you really ought to go and buy such and such a car, then you need to start afresh and make it simple. Look at the choke points, look at the problem areas, look where the complaints come, and then train the staff or change the process so that you've got something that really is slick, it works, it can be AI enabled, which makes it cheaper, and then you also don't have the penalty costs of FCA enforcement activity.
And I'm listening to this conversation perhaps, and I'm thinking, this all sounds great. What's your advice? How do they start?
I think the first thing you do is you work out what your selling process is. So you look at your product and your product approval. I'm talking the financial services products, not the vehicles.
Sure.
Not my area. But you take your products, you look at your product design, you put that through a decent product approval process, you test it, you then validate it. You train the staff well before you roll it out, but you design training that's suited for the staff, for the roles, for the level of seniority they are, so that it's fit for purpose. You then sell it, you look at the data you're collecting, you look at the complaints, you weave that back into your training, you weave it into your risk management, you change it, you change the oversight, the management, the coaching activities that are undertaken. And then if you're going to consolidate it all up, you've got to look at that in the light of the strategy and what does it do for you as a business.
And when you're trying to sell that in to your board or your team, how do you go about doing that?
Two different ways. If it's the board level, it's let's do a high level process review or a governance review. Let's think about the practicalities of how you control what's going on. It's all about control of the process and appropriate control of the people so that they can do the right thing. So high level review, quick and dirty. See what's going on, see where they've had problems, see where their complaints or where the regulatory scrutiny is falling. Then look at some of those processes, redesign some of those processes with them. And then for me, often it's rethink the training, whether it's the briefings at the boardroom, it's the middle management coaching, because you've got tone from the top, tone from within, which is the middle management, walking the talk, bring your whole self to work. Is the culture conducive to selling things appropriately, looking after the customer appropriately? I think that's often a fundamental question. If it is, then look at how you deliver the training underneath that so that the staff are automatically meeting the regulations. They're just doing it right because that's your policies, that's your procedures, and use AI avatars to give them fake customers that they can practice on and give them maybe one a month as a coffee break to sort of, write the answer to. I mean, we did one, didn't we? Peter Smith.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I still remember him. He couldn't do percentages. And I had to explain all the basic maths and the fees so that he could understand it so he could buy a car safely. But I think you could use that an awful lot more. And then, of course, you can take the learning from the complaints handling and the complaints that are coming through, or the places where the staff really struggle to complete their training. And then you can tweak that experience. So next month, you get a different personality with a different proposition, and the staff can have a little bit of high level micro training, a few minutes of video, a couple of, strap lines appearing on the PC or on the phone app. Bit of quiz stuff on the phone in an all hands or a town hall. So you make it quite a lot of fun, and then you test it, and then you give them the new scenarios and see how they get on with that, and then you round and round and round. So good governance, effective governance, operational governance looks at the risks, looks at what's going wrong, takes a decision about maybe expenditure or changes to process to make it right, puts that in, sees how it goes. So you end up with this lovely benign circle of doing things right, which generates more things going right, which generates less regulatory scrutiny and appropriate profit.
And tell me a little bit about sort of who's doing it well? What you pointed obviously to kind of non-regulatory and compliance kind of folks, but like you mentioned Fortnite and so on and so forth. Are there any kind of folks that you go, these guys are on their way, this is the bar, this is the benchmark?
I think on the whole, there's nobody there yet.
Okay.
I see quite a lot of, and I do quite a lot of painful CBT. I've got about 20 units for one of my boards waiting at the moment, and it's going to be quite generic. They're in the process of changing it and making it AI enabled, video rich, gamified. So they're on that journey, which is probably part of why I joined them, because they're interested in this stuff. But on the whole, when I go into clients, it's very clunky, very generic. Might even include American proceeds of crime act. And you're like, well, you're not even allowed to sell to American citizens. Why is this one in? Why are you muddling people up with the wrong stuff?
Right.
So I'm not seeing an awful lot of stuff that makes you think, oh, that was all right. Oh, I don't mind that. You get the dreaded email in the inbox. You have some more cybersecurity training, some more online training. And
rolling your eyes.
Everybody rolls their eyes to heaven. Everybody else in the room goes, oh, have you got it too? Oh, it's that time of year. oh, I suppose I better do it. And then the reminder, and the manager's wasting all that time reminding you. You'd love to do it, wouldn't you? And the answer is no, of course I don't want to do it. So there's a whole lot more management time wasted. And then you do it, and then you've sort of in one ear and out the other so often. And so to move to something that gave you what was relevant for your job at your seniority in bite-sized chunks that stuck in your memory, like 1970s adverts. Our white lemonade drinker, thank Crunchy, it's Friday. I mean,
Clunk,
people have
click. I mean, you
absolutely.
right.
You see, we can all rattle
Yeah.
off whatever the ads, but almost at that level. So as somebody is talking to a customer, it goes ting, and they think that bit. And actually, and it was one of the things in Positive Power and Influence, which was a Shepherd Moscow course. They almost gave you phrases for managing the transaction, the interaction in difficult situations. So, avoiding the difficult messages, building consensus. And you came away from their course with strap lines that you sort of gradually absorbed as yours, changed the phrasing, but they still had the same sort of technique behind them. And you just rattled them off. And I still find myself thinking, oh, I know where that one came from when I'm sitting in a board meeting or I'm doing a consulting job. It's like, I know that one. And it would be great if we could get that subliminal messaging, but also the confidence that staff are doing it right. Because I think there's also the other side, which is that absolute dread of appraisals. So some firms do them quarterly to try and reduce the stress. I'm not sure whether it does. Some have the annual appraisal. And one or two firms I'm aware of have got rid of it completely and just do live feedback. And then, of course, you're sort of sitting there wondering how the pay rise works. So I don't think anybody's got it right. And I think there's not been a lot of appetite to think about the human governance and control and training and competence. Everything's always about whether the computer processes work or a manufacturing process works. It's quite a primitive way of approaching it. We don't really spend enough time thinking about how the people work. And, we don't think enough time about management skills. You have to be quite a long way up the tree often to go on an MBA, but it's quite often theoretical. HNCs and some of those other qualifications of the old days about being a practical middle manager have sort of fallen by the wayside. But I don't see a lot of training coming in to coach and build that. Partly it's expensive, it requires humans, but actually you could do it with AI. You could do a mix of AI and video and then practice and then real life, get the feedback from the team. And I think the firms that are going to be really effective are the ones that are going to take this sort of hybrid and more modern approach and do something that means that they can say, hand on heart, that for each of those staff members, they know that based on what you're retaining from the AI responses and what you've downloaded into the HR record and what they see and the absence of complaints and just the mood music on the floor, that they're pretty sure that those staff are doing it right. Because you can't tape everything. In a call centre, you can tape it and you can coach, but you can only listen to so many calls. And there are always circumstances around it. But once you're in a branch or on a forecourt, you've really, unless you're eavesdropping, and that's only a sample, you've got no real idea what people are saying and how they're selling it. So when a customer does complain, you have to assume that it landed with the customer a particular way. So train the salesman to read, or salesperson, to read that body language, to do the checking, the reinforcing, the second explaining, the giving time and space. Those are skills and they take time to build up. But I think if you build them up, then you're going to be in a much stronger position commercially. And I think you're also going to be at a lot less regulatory attention.
It's interesting you mentioned skills. What for you are the emerging skills and competencies for this sort of new age that we're kind of operating? Some people call it the fourth industrial revolution, whatever you want to kind of, what do you think is really key and critical to kind of succeed today at dealing with some of the challenges that we talked about so far today?
A lot of it comes down to really basic communication skills. We're not taught to listen to people. We're not really taught to explain ourselves succinctly. You get the 20-second elevator pitch, and it's like, well, how am I meant to get a job on that interview based on this? What are they going to ask me next? How to build a dialogue, how to build rapport, and then how to communicate based on the customer or the other person's capacity to learn. You do it automatically with a child. You come down to, you know, they're 5, they count the sweets on their fingers. You are not going to be explained that 10% of those sweets are red. You know, it doesn't matter. They want 5. Actually, they want 10. And then you come up and then you get percentages. And did they really learn them at school or not? So if you're talking APRs, you might have to come back and explain the math. If they start to glaze over, you've probably got a signal and you're going to have to stop your patter and come back and go, are you okay with these sorts of sums? Do you want me to come back and cover it separately? You might want to go home and look at this website that explains them. You know, you've got to think about, how do I do it right? Your companion, not the salesperson too any longer. You've got to sit alongside that customer and take them through that journey. And I think if we had skills training that covered not just the nuts and bolts of what it is and how it works and how many repayments, but talked about how you accompany the customer, that's when you're going to get consumer duty right.
Fascinating. Isn't it funny how we've come all this way with technology and now we're still going back to the point you made earlier of Northern Rock and people being absolutely at the centre?
And I think one of the challenges, and it's an intergenerational challenge, is that people communicate differently. So if I want my son to come down for dinner, I quite often text him or WhatsApp him. I Slack colleagues at work. If I'm really annoyed at my son, I phone him. He doesn't always answer, but he comes down. And then I use the house phone as, you know, line of last resort on the intercom, sort of, dinner is served. But if you think about that, you know, and we're 40 years apart in age, then you're also picking up the, do you prefer to learn this way? Do you prefer to communicate with somebody this way? Somebody comes in who's a different age group. How do you say hi to them? Is it hello? Is it hi? Is it how do you do? You know, so it's understanding where different people and different heritages and different styles of people are coming from and matching that and mirroring it and reflecting it so that you build that rapport that enables you to do your job, which is to sell a vehicle and its finance safely, and for them to understand what they're getting into and to be comfortable with the decision and pleased with the purchase, not have it with a financial sort of, I don't quite know what it is, but at some point there's a big bill coming, sitting over their head. And I think if we can move into that much more, it's almost a more professional, but it's also a much more human dynamic. And I think it's that recognition that everybody's different and you've got to be able to look at their presentation, their behaviour, and work out how to match that and where to put them in the way that you have been trained onto the right journey.
I love that idea of being empathetic and adapting, you know, not just in the language, but also in the channel that you and the mode, you know, that you're actually kind of communicating. And you talked earlier a little bit about sort of, you know, American being kind of, you know, included in some of the kind of the content. And I was just wondering about sort of, you know, we're operating in a very kind of global society today. It doesn't really matter where we are, but here we are in the UK. Tell me a little bit about sort of how you kind of think about regulation and compliance from more of a global standpoint. Where is the UK on the scale, and how do you how what can we learn from elsewhere?
The American system is quite different and far more rules based. So I tend to leave that to one side. That's different practitioners. We're still very aligned to all the European regulations, but we are further ahead than them on the consumer protection journey. Now you have got price and product regulators like South Africa, where it's more ring fenced and corralled. But actually, the UK regulators are seen as really leading authorities for the colleges of regulators when they all have their get-togethers on the conduct stuff. We are seen as leading edge, probably APRA, the Australian regulator, and probably some of the Anglo-Saxon historic connected regulators have a similarity, but it's always applied in their own culture. But I think we are the first to do a consumer duty approach. And actually, when you look at what's in consumer duty, it's, am I selling the right thing fairly to a person who understands what I'm telling them? And have I made it as easy as possible for them to understand me and get to the outcome?
And thinking about you entering in to that first sort of job that you talked about at the beginning, what's What's the advice? What's the one piece of advice that you would give someone entering this industry now?
I think the key piece is to go with your passion. You'll find something, you'll be sent to some department, or you'll happen to have a job that you think, I really like getting out of bed in the morning to go and do this. And instead of it being a chore to get up on a Monday, you're actually quite happy, and you'll find things about the work come into your mind at the weekends, and that's not a problem. So I think don't think you're going to be in a set path the whole time. See what you enjoy, seize the opportunities that come your way, because your passion will be contagious to others, and then you'll find the opportunities to do what you really like.
You've certainly infected me today. Thank you, Serena.
You're very welcome. Really good to talk to you. Thanks, Justin.